Welcome back to another building video, and today we're going to add UI, and we're going to have list-based system, and we are also going to have a grid-based system. So let's start off. For both of these, well, obviously we're going to need some icons. We don't really have any information about the icons inside of our buildables as of right now, so let's go ahead and let's give a slot where we can fit those icons, and we can do that inside of our buildings folder. We have a S buildables structure, which holds all the information about our buildables, like what is the mesh, what traces it uses, which actors are going to get spawned, and all kinds of other information. So let's add a new variable, and let's call this icon. And let's make the variable type in a texture 2D, like so. So now we will be able to store the icons in there. Now I don't have any icons for this project, so what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to set up a default icon so that it would fill out all the items with that single icon for now. So we can go to the icon and select an icon, and once I click save, now all the items will receive this icon. Now if you want to change the individual icons, you can go to your buildables database, which is based off of this S buildable structure, so it will have all those values. We can select all the individual buildables that we might have, and at the bottom we can change the icon for every single one of our buildables. And let's say this one is going to be this red face, and the floor, let's say, is going to be this spawn point icon. Now all the other ones, I'm going to leave them at default, but obviously you can change them to whatever you like. Now it doesn't matter whether this is a grid or a list-based system. For both of these, I want to display the resources that are going to be needed in order to finish this build. So we need to create some kind of a tiny UI for that, so that we can add those to our existing widgets. And it's going to be easier if we have a separate widget for that. Technically, we could cheat just like I did over here and add the item data widget that you can see at the top right of our screens. So it displays what resources are needed for this build to be finished. But since this is during the gameplay, when we are inside of the game, we can't use our mouse, so we can't really drag from that. But in reality, if we could, if I do shift F1, no, it still doesn't work. But technically I could be able to drag this if I had a mouse available to me at this point. So I can't really reuse that, because inside of our build menu we are going to be able to use our mouse, and then, well, our drag events, drop events are going to be functional. So I'm going to have to create my own. So I'm going to right click, create a user interface widget blueprint, and I'm going to call this UI build needed resource. And I'm going to be using this for both the grid and the list based ones. Now what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to go to the palette, and I'm going to look for a horizontal box, so all of my elements would be spaced out horizontally, and I don't need the canvas panel. So I'm going to right click on the canvas panel, and I'm going to replace it with the child, and therefore it's going to remove the canvas panel, and now the main parent is going to be our horizontal box. Now we need to add some things that we want to display. So first we need an icon, so I'm going to look for an image, and we're going to add an image. So we're going to have an image for our icon, and then I'm going to need two texts. So I'm going to look for a text and drag two texts inside of the horizontal box. So it's going to look something like this. So the first thing is our image. So I'm going to rename this to be icon, and I want to make sure that this is a variable so that we can actually edit this value. And just as a placeholder, I'm going to add the default icon, like so. Now it's going to look very ugly for you right now, but don't worry, I'm going to show you how to fix that so that we can actually see how it's going to look in the actual finished widget. But for now, just leave it be. We're going to fix that in a second with just 2 tiny clicks. The next thing is we have a text, and I'm going to rename this to be name, which is going to be the item name, and I want to make sure that this is a variable. And I also want to align this vertically to the middle, so it's always right in the middle. And I want to do exactly the same thing for the other text, but the difference is that this is going to be called amount. Since this is going to hold the amount, I'm going to make this is variable. I'm going to change the content of this, so the default text would be some kind of a number, in this case 12, and I'm going to align this vertically to the middle as well. There we go. So now let's make sure that we can actually see it, how it's going to be seen in the actual widget that's going to be on our screens. So you can go to the kind of top right of kind of the viewport, well, the graph middle part. So you can select this, fill screen, and change it to desired on screen. So now it's going to give you a way better representation of what it's actually going to be looking like. So it's going to look something like this. Now, obviously, you can style this. So let's say we want to add some background to this. What you can do is always right-click your horizontal box and wrap it with a border. And then inside of the border, you can add like an image background to it if you want, or you can change, where was it? Brush color? No, yeah, brush color. We can change the brush color to whatever we want the background to be. So I'm going to set just this to something grayish, like so. Good. Now let's go inside of our graph and let's actually make sure that we can fill out the information so that we can change the icons for every single one of our items, the names and the amounts. So we can go to the graph and let's leave the event construct because we're going to need that. And we need a variable which actually holds the item that is needed for us to finish the build. So I'm going to add a new variable and I'm going to call this item. Now for me, I'm using my free inventory system, and the items variable in my situation is the slots variable. Now obviously if you have a different inventory system, your items might be called a little bit differently. But I'm going to make sure that both of these, this variable is instance editable and exposed on spawn so that we can actually provide this. Now, like I said, if you have your inventory system, make sure you change this to your items type. Good. So now, since we have done that, we can go ahead and get our item. We can drag from this and we can break this. Now, this system that I'm using is using a data table system. So I don't really have any other information inside of here as of right now, only the amount. So I'm going to go ahead and set the amount then. So I'm going to grab the amount, get this, and I'm going to set text like so. And we're going to do that on our construction. And I'm going to plug in the in text inside of the amount. And therefore now it is going to display us the amount. Now we need to set up the other two things as well, like the name and the icon. And to do so, I need to dive into my database and actually request for that information. So I'm going to drag the item in. I'm going to go ahead and break the slot structure. I'm going to right click the item, split it to get the data table and the row name. And from this we can get data table row. Connect it up, connect the row name, and from the out row we can do a break as inventory structure, which is the structure used to store the information about all the items inside of the database. So as you can see now, here we have all the other information like name, description, types, icons, meshes, all that good stuff. So we can now use these values to set up the other two variables. So we can get our icon and we can set brush from texture. Connect it up to row found and plug in the texture to the icon like so. The other thing is the name, so we can get that and we can again do set text because that is a text field, and I'm actually going to drag this back and I'm going to fit this in between. So I'm going to bring this up, connect the executions to be in line like so. And then I'm going to drag from the name and connect it in the text, like so. So now our needed resource widget is finished, and it's automatically going to change these values and display the item that is going to be needed. So now we need the actual widgets that are going to hold the buildables. So we're going to have the main widget, which is going to be basically like a full screen widget, which is going to be our build menu, and then we're going to have individual elements that are going to get displayed for every single one of our buildables. So first let's go to user interface, create a blueprint widget, and this is going to be our full screen main widget. So I'm going to call this UI build menu. You can open this, but we're going to work in this at the very end. But what we do need now is the list or the grid widget. So this is going to hold a single instance of our buildable. So every single one of our buildables is going to have this widget. So we're going to go to the user interfaces, create a widget blueprint, and I'm going to call this UI build list item. And based on whether you want a grid or a list, you just need one of these. So this is going to be for the list, and I'm going to add another widget, which is going to be our UI build grid item. So let's open both of these up well, or at least one of these that you have. So we have a list and a grid one. And very similarly to like before, what I want to do is in the list, at least, I want to look for a horizontal box. I want to bring this on top. I want to right click this, well, right click the canvas panel and replace it with the child. So again, the canvas panel would be gone. We don't need it, but we do need a horizontal box. And just like before, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and have an icon. So an image, not item, image. So this is going to be our buildables icon. And then also we need a text for what's the name of this thing that we are going to build. Now I'm going to select the image and again change its name to icon. Make sure that this is a variable. And for now, again, I'm going to set just a preview of icon like so. Click on the text and rename this to build, let's call this buildable, buildable name rather maybe. And make this into a variable so that again we can change this in the graph, and we want to align this to the middle. And again, to have a better representation of how it's actually going to look, we're going to click on fill screen, desired on screen. There we go. Now we also will want to add the resources that are needed. So we're going to go ahead and add another horizontal box inside of our existing one at the very end, like so. And inside of here, we want to rename this to needed resources and make this into is variable, like so. Now let's go to the graph. Delete again all the unnecessary events. Let's leave the event construct one. And let's provide some information. So just like previously we did with the build resources, we're going to need a variable which is going to hold all the information about the build that we are actually about to build. So let's add a new variable and let's call this build. And for us, the build is the S buildables structure. And we're going to make this instance editable and exposed on spawn. So exactly, pretty much exactly the same thing as we just did with the build needed resources. Since it's both are in the horizontal alignment, it's going to look very, very similar to when it comes to creating it. So again, let's grab our build. Let's get this. Let's drag from this and let's break it. Now, luckily for us, we don't have like two variables like we had for the items, so we instantly can get all the information about our buildable. So first we have our buildable name, so we can get the buildable name, and from here we can go ahead and set text. And what I just now noticed is, since I was scrolling previously, I don't actually have any names. So let's go ahead and let's set those up really quickly. So we can, hopefully this isn't going to crash because these are open. So maybe just in case, I'm actually going to close all of these, because sometimes Unreal does like to crash when things are open that are, if we make changes to something that's in use right now. So we can go to our S buildables and let's add this a new variable and let's call this name, and let's make this into a text because, well, we are using a text essentially. And I'm going to bring this to the very top so it's a little bit easier for me to edit this. Good. Then I'm going to go to my database and I'm going to actually set up the names. So we have foundation, floor, and I'm going to speed it up. Good. So I have set up all the names for my buildables, so that's good. Now we can go back and open up our widgets back up. And I think maybe they wouldn't even crash because we didn't really actually use it just yet. So back inside of our list item, let's go back to the graph. And now we have the name variable over here as well. So we can just directly plug it in and it's going to set up the name for us. The next thing we need is the icon. So just like before, we're going to grab the icon variable. We're going to get this and we're going to set brush from texture. Connect it up and connect the texture to the icon. There we go. Compile and save this, and we are good with those two default elements. And now we also need to provide the needed resources for our build. So we're going to need our needed resources. So we're going to get this. So this is a horizontal box. And what we want to do over here, we want to add a child to horizontal box. Now we need to create that child. And those children are going to be our build needed resource widgets. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to get the build once more, just so I have less routing. And I'm going to go ahead and break this. And what I'm going to do over here is we have the items that are necessary for our build to be finished. And this is an array of multiple items probably. Well, not for all of them, but for quite a few of them. So we can drag from this and we can do a loop for each. So for each loop, so it's going to go through all of those buildables. And we want to create widgets for every single one of the items that are going to be needed for us to finish the build. So under the loop body, we can do create widget to create those smaller widgets. And the class is our build needed resource. So we have our build needed resource, and we can plug in the array element straight into the item, and the return value goes as a content for our child that we are adding to our horizontal box. Compile and save this. So now what's going to happen is we're going to have our list like we see over here, plus at the very end it's going to add a couple of these ones as well. Okay, so that's good. Now if you want it to be a little bit smaller so that you can actually see the difference between them, what I could suggest is we have this horizontal box. We could right click this and we could wrap this with a size box. And if we would select the size box, we can actually adjust the size, how big it's actually going to be. Now we don't have any predetermined size for our list itself. So what I would suggest is actually doing the same thing for the main horizontal box as well. So I'm going to right click the horizontal box and I'm going to wrap this with another size box. So just basically so that I know what are actually going to be those sizes. So this is going to make my life a lot easier when deciding what amount to provide. And all I'm going to change is just the height of it. Now for the width, I'm going to use the entire width of the widget, but for the height, I want to make some adjustments. So let's say I want to make sure that my widget is just 100 units, like so. Now this is going to stretch out the icon in my situation because my icon is 64 by 64. So we can actually change this to like 100 by 100 and it's going to make our icon look way better now. But for the needed resources, I want to make sure that those are a little bit smaller. So I'm going to again override the height and I'm going to say that the height on this one is going to be half size. So let's make maybe this into a 50 and let's make this that we align this vertically like so. And now those are going to be a bit smaller. Now obviously you can apply multiple different style changes to this. I'm going to leave this be. So now we have our list item and I'm going to have some text on the screens to timestamp where you need to skip if you don't care about the grid, if you want just the list one. And now we're going to talk about the grid item and create the widget for the grid item. And it's going to be quite a bit similar. So instead of previously we used a horizontal box for the list, for the grid, we're going to use a vertical box. So a lot of things are going to be very, very similar. Now we can again right click the canvas panel and we can go ahead and replace with a child. So now the vertical widget is the main widget. Well, the main element of the widget. And just like before, we want to have an image, which is got our icon for the buildable. And then we're going to have a text inside of our vertical box. And I'm also going to add another vertical box inside of this vertical box, which is going to store the information about the resources that are needed for our build to be finished. Good. So let's go ahead and let's adjust the names of these things. So first we have the image, and I'm going to rename this to be the icon. And I'm going to set up a default icon for now, like so. Now it's going to stretch it out. Don't worry, we're going to fix that. Select the text next, and which is going to be our buildable name. And let's make this into a variable. And let's make sure that we align this horizontally to the middle. And therefore, it's always going to stay in the middle. And it's going to look way better that way. Then we also have this vertical box, which is actually going to be our resources needed. And we're going to make this into a variable, like so. and we're gonna make sure that maybe we align this horizontally to the middle, or yeah, let's make this into the middle. Maybe we can stretch out the vertical, but horizontal would be better if it's right in the middle. So our resources would be in the middle. Good. Now let's click on fill screen and change this to desired screen. And this is going to give us the actual look of this thing, how it's actually going to look like. Now, if the icon stretches out and if you don't want it to be stretched out, what you can do is select the icon and make sure that this is aligned like so. Well, mostly in this situation, only the horizontal, and this way it's not going to get stretched out. It's only going to use the amount of space that it needs as it's set over here for the image size. If you want to make this bigger, you can obviously set this to be bigger, and now it's going to be 100 by 100. Good. So far, so good. Let's go ahead and provide the actual information. So let's go to the graph, delete these two nodes. We just need the event construct, and similar, well, exactly the same as we did inside of our build needed resources widget. We also need to provide some kind of a variable which gives us the information about what we need. So in this case, we need a new variable, and I'm going to call this buildable, and well, let's call this build, just like I did for the list widget rather. And then the variable type in this case is our sBuildables variable. And just like with the item, we want to make sure this is instance editable and exposed on spawn. Okay, so far so good. So now we can grab our build, we can get this, and we can go ahead and break the structure. And this way, this instantly returns us all the information about our buildables. And since we don't have like two variables like I have for items, this instantly returns us all the information. Now, what you might notice is if you skip the list item, you will not have the name variable. So what I did was I went to sBuildable structure. I added the new variable, and I gave it a name of name, and I made this into a text type of a variable. And once I did that, I saved the structure, closed it off. I went inside of my buildables database, and for every single one of these elements, I added their name. So I call them wall, door, window, house, wall, floor, and foundation. So fill those out, and once you do, it's going to return you those values as well, so the names. Good. So now back in our build grid item, what we want to do over here is again grab our things that we have over here, like the build name. So we can get that, and we can set text, connect it up, and connect in text to the name, like so. The other one is our icon. So we can get the icon, and just like in the resources needed, we want to do set brush from texture, connect it up, and plug in the texture in the icon, like so. So now it's going to provide us with the name and the icon of our buildable. Now we also have a location at the bottom for our resources needed. So we're going to use our build needed resources widget for this as well. So at the end of this whole thing, we can grab our build once more, just so that there's a little less routing. I'm going to break this, and inside of this structure, we actually have information about all the items that are needed for our build to be created. So from this, we can do a loop for each loop, connect it up, and now we will be able to populate our resources needed, a vertical box, with a bunch of these UI needed resources widgets. So we can go ahead, grab our resources needed, we can get that, and we can do add child to vertical box. Now we need some kind of a content that we can actually that's actually the actual child itself, and for that, inside of our loop, or throughout the loop's body, we want to create widget, and we're going to create our build needed resources, and we can plug in the array element into the item, and then connect the pins. The execution goes over here, and the return value goes into the content, and therefore now it's going to create a bunch of those smaller widgets underneath. Good. So far so good. So we are done with the grid for now. We might want to change some sizes that I did in the grid in the list one, but well, we're going to do that in a second. So let's go to our UI build menu widget, which is actually going to be the widget that's actually going to get displayed. And well, we're gonna need to do a couple of things over here. So first we need a location where we're gonna populate the things. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a vertical box. So I'm gonna actually have both of these at the same time. So I'm gonna have one vertical box over here. So I'm gonna make this roughly over here, like so. So let's actually make this at the left side, and let's do 750 by 750, position minus 425. No, it's actually 375. There we go. So half value, so it's right in the middle. And let's align this like 100 units from the wall. So this is going to be, I'm going to rename this to, this is going to be our list menu, and we're going to make this into a variable. And for the other one, I'm going to do the same thing. Well, no, not the vertical box. We need a grid. So we're going to look for a grid, uniform grid panel. We're going to bring this in. We're going to move this to the other side. So we're going to make this align to the right side in this case. The size is again going to be 750 by 750. The minus is going to be minus 850. So again, 100 units from the side. And the position is going to be minus 375. There we go. And I'm going to rename this to the grid menu and make this into a variable. So now I have both the list and the grid. Good. So now let's go inside of our graph, and we have our event construct. So now on the construct, what we are going to do is we're going to cast to the third person character. So our character, which actually holds the buildables database, and as the object we can get owning player pawn, like so. Good. Now let's see, it's been a while since I've been last in this project, so let me find where we have our buildables database. I believe it's inside of the build component itself and not the character. So we have our build component, and yeah, our buildables are inside of that component. So what we want to do is inside of our build menu over here, as the third person character, we want to get the build component first, and then from the build component we want to get buildables. And just for the simplicity purposes, I'm actually going to promote this to a variable so that this variable would live inside of this widget so that I have less routing. Good. So now let's populate the list. So we're going to add a custom event. So add new custom event, and let's call this create list. This is going to be very simple. We're going to grab our buildables. We're going to get those, and then we're going to do a loop for each. And just like previously with the resources needed, what we did was we made a create widget, and we created a bunch of widgets. In this case, we need our build list item, and the build goes directly from the array element. And then we can grab our list menu, we can get that, and we can go ahead and add a child to vertical box. Connect it like so, and connect the content like so. And then we can just simply run this create list at the end over here. So we're going to go ahead and create list like so. So that was for the list. So technically the list is now ready to go. So again, I'm going to add some text for you to skip this. And let's create the grid. So for the grid, we're going to go ahead and right click, and we're going to add a new custom event, and we're going to call this create grid. There we go. We have our grid. And just like we did for the list, we're going to grab our buildables. We're going to get those. We're going to do loop for each so that we would use all of our buildables. And then just like in the resources needed, we want to create a widget. And the widget is our UI grid item. We can connect our array element into the build. And then we can grab our grid menu. We can get this, and we can add child to uniform grid. Connect it up, connect the content. Now, if you're using some different Unreal Engine versions or maybe different grid elements or whatever, what you can do, sometimes you don't have the in row and in column, and if you don't have those, then you can always drag from your grid menu and you can set row. You should be able to also set column. Since I have those, I can't really do that, but if you don't have these over here, you should be able to grab them from the variable, and then you can set those afterwards. Okay, so that's good. So now we need the row and the column itself. So for this one, we actually need a new variable so that we can specify how many things per row we want to use. So I'm going to add a new variable, and I'm going to call this items per row, and I'm going to make this into a integer, and at the bottom we should be able to set up the value, and let's say I want to have 3 items per row, like so. So now we need to do some math to actually calculate this. So we need items per row, we want to get those. So what we want to do over here next is we want to right click in the event graph and we want to do a division, but we don't want to use integers. Instead we want to use float divided by a float, and then we can connect our array index to the top one, like so, and we can connect our items per row in the bottom one, like so. And now from this value that it returns to us, we can do a truncate. So we can do truncate, and then this is going to calculate us the proper row that needs to be used. So we can then just plug this into the row. Now we need to also calculate the column, and for the column what I'm going to do is from these two conversions over here, from the top one I'm going to do division, whole and remainder. So the top one is the dividend, and the bottom one, the divisor, is our items per row. And this will return us the value, and this value is going to be our in column, so our column ID, like so. And we should be good with our grid, except for we don't have any predetermined sizes. So back inside of our designer, we can actually do a lot of adjustments inside of our grid menu. So we could add what is the size, the minimum, and the minimum width and the minimum height of our things. So let's do some basic math. So we have our size X is 750, and if we want to use 3 icons per row, then well, it's going to be roughly 250 units, but we also need a padding. So I'm gonna say that the size is gonna be like 200 by 200, and we're gonna add like 25 padding. It might be too much, my math not great. Anyway, experiment with this. I'm gonna plug in 25 and we'll see how it's gonna work. So now both the list and the grid are set up. Now we might run into a couple of issues that we can't really fit enough things inside of these, but well, we're going to deal with those once we actually display this widget on our screen. So let's finally see if whatever we did inside of this whole video actually does work, and hopefully it does. I have an error over here, so that's good to know. So you might get some errors as well. So our icon is a bit broken. We can click that off. And that is for our set. We don't have those values inside of the memory. We don't really need those. The buildable itself doesn't care about the name and the icon whenever it is getting built. But if you do care about that, if you want those, then you have to add those to your S saved builds and connect those up, just like we did with all the other values. But they are not really needed, for me at least. I don't utilize those, so they're not going to be ever visible. So let's go to our third-person character. Let's look for our begin play event, and under our begin play event, at the very end of it, not at the very end, I'm gonna have the timer. Before the timer, I'm going to do something very similar to what we did already here. We're gonna go ahead and create a widget, just the user interface widget, not the function from the inventory system. And we're going to create our build menu, and we're actually going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And we're going to call this build menu. Connect it up, and we're good with this. Now we actually need to display this. We just created it, but we also need to display this, And previously we used the B key event to actually initiate our build mode. Now instead of initiating our build mode, we're gonna wanna initiate our widget instead. So for now, I'm gonna move this aside, but I'm gonna leave this be just in case if things go wrong, so that we have a backup, so that we can get back to whatever we had. So over here, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna grab our build menu. We're gonna get this, and we're gonna check is visible. So we're gonna see if this is visible, so whether this is on our screens. And from here, we can do an if. So on pressed, we're gonna check if the widget is already on our screens. Now, if it's true, what we can do is just simply remove from parent, like so. But if it's false, if it's not visible, we want to make sure that this is visible. So we can grab our build menu and we can do add to viewport, like so. Now also we're going to want to have some mouse and some control over so inside of our widget. So what we can do is I'm going to go ahead and grab the build menu. I'm going to get the owning player. So this is going to return us our controller. And from our controller, we can do set show mouse cursor. So at the top over here, we're going to want to set this to false so that it would remove, so basically hide our mouse. But at the bottom, once we add the widget to our screen, connect the target, make sure to connect the target. We want to set this to be true so that we can actually display the mouse. The next thing that we want to do is change the focus between the game and the widget. So whenever we remove the widget from our screen, as the controller, we want to do set input mode game only. So this is going to focus back to the game, and it's no longer going to focus on the widget. But once we create the widget, we want to do set input mode game and UI. So now it's going to focus more on the widget rather than the game. And we want to use the in widget to focus to be our build menu widget, like so. And now let me do some small reroute to make it look a little nicer. There we go. Now before we click the B key inside of the UI build menu under the event construct, I forgot to launch the grid event. So we have one for the list, one for the grid. So let's make sure we run that one. So create grid, and now both the list and the grid should be displaying. So if we're going to press play, press B, we have a bunch of issues. So first and foremost, I guess I have some math issue with the grid. Every element gets put in the same location. Left side seems somewhat good, but if we spam the B key, we multiply things. Now, before we fix the issue with duplicating the things, this is actually a very good time to test what happens, to fix what happens when we have too many elements and they can't simply fit in the screen, because we can actually duplicate them so I don't have to add any extra things in the database. So, in the UI build menu, we have our list and we have our grid. Now, what we can do is select them, right-click them, and wrap them with a scroll box, like so. And what this allows us to do is actually fit more things inside of it, so we can scroll up and down and see them all. So we're going to do the same thing for the grid. We're going to wrap it with a scroll box. And now if we spam the B a bit, so there's more things, we can actually scroll and see all the entries in the list. Now obviously you can style your scroll bars by just selecting the scroll box itself, and then under the style, and there's a bar style, there's a lot of settings that you can make to stylize that. So let's fix the duplicating issues. So one of the issues is in the graph, in the UI build menu, I made a mistake by using the wrong event. So we are using the event construct, and this gets ran every time when we add this to the screen. We don't want to do that. Instead, we just want to run it once, because this widget gets created only once. So we're going to right click and do event initialize on initialized instead. We're going to connect that and remove the old one. There we go. So that's one of the issues fixed. So now we no longer will see things getting added more when it comes to actually entries in the buildables list, but there are still issues with the resource requirements getting duplicated. And to fix that, it's actually pretty much exactly the same issue. So in the build item, instead of using the event construct, we want to use event on initialized. But this isn't going to fix this instantly. So if we press play, you can see there's default icons and there's no text. That is because the event initialized is getting ran very early in this whole process, and it can't really grab the necessary information for this whole thing that we need for the items. So what we want to do is actually give this 1 frame delay, and we can give this a single frame delay by simply adding a delay node and leaving this at 0. So it's going to be completely invisible. It's just going to skip 1 frame. And we're going to do exactly the same thing for the grid as well. So we have the event on initialized, like so. Press play. There we go. So nothing gets duplicated. Now let's fix the grid so that it fits perfectly. And that's an issue over here. And I connected the wrong thing. So instead of the return value for being the column, instead we want to use the reminder. So once we plug that in, it converts it into a truncate, and it fixes our issue. There we go. So we have all of these things available to us. Good. So now let's go ahead and make sure that we can actually click on these things. So the following steps are going to apply for both the list and the grid. So the thing that we're going to do is exactly the same. First, we need to, whenever we click a buildable, we want to set up a build ID, because if we look in our build component, whenever we spawn something, we're using the ID. Whenever we run our build cycle, we do our tracing. To get the information, we need the ID of which buildable we actually want to use. And to get this ID, we actually need to provide it inside of the widget. So under the build item, we're going to add a new variable and call this index. And we're going to make this into an integer, instance editable, and exposed on spawn. Now, since we now need to, we're going to provide this to the widget, and then once we click this, we want to pass along this index to the build component. And also, we're going to need to remove the widget once we click on a selection. So we also will need our player's reference. So I'm going to add a new variable and call this player ref. We're going to make this into a third-person character reference, instance editable, exposed on spawn, like so. And now I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the grid. So we're going to have an index, exposed, player ref, both of them have the same thing, and now we need to pass that information to this widget because, well, we have to set these values somewhere, and we're going to do that inside of our build menu. And up here we can see under the list we have the index only, and here we have nothing. So if we go to the file and refresh all nodes, if we did expose these on spawn, they should be visible over here. So let's connect the array index, and we need the player reference as well, and we're going to get that from over here. So what I'm going to do in here is actually simply promote this to a variable, and we have our player's reference available to us. So now we can plug this variable inside of here. So we're going to grab that, plug it in, and do the same for the grid. Connect the index from the array and third-person character reference, like so. Good. Now, back inside of our build item, now we need to create a on-click event. So something happens when we click the button, when it's on top of this whole object. So for this, either you can use a button and wrap this whole thing with a button. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the functions override, and I'm going to override the on mouse button down event. So whenever we click anywhere on this item, it's going to get, well, we're going to launch the build mode and build something. So if we create this and compile, you will see we get a warning. That is because, well, return node requires us to give some kind of a value, and we can actually just simply drag from it and make an event reply, and that should fix the issue for us. Good. So now whenever we click on something, we want to pass along the index, like I said, to the build component. So we're going to need our player. We're going to grab the player. From the player, we're going to get build component. And then from our build component, we can just simply set build ID. There we go, connect it up. And for the build ID, we're going to use the index, like so. Good. Now the next thing is we need to launch the build mode. So we can drag from the build component and we can do launch build mode, like so. Now we also will need to remove the widget from our screen, but I believe we don't have an option like that as of right now. So in our third-person character, under the B key, where we actually add or remove the widget, we can just simply add a new custom event, and let's call this remove build menu. And we want to connect this to the top route, so the true route. So whenever our widget is visible, then it gets removed. And that means that now we can use this event to remove the widget from our screens. So in the build list, after we launch the build mode, I'm going to grab player's reference once more, and I'm going to remove build menu, like so. So now that's going to get removed, and we can connect the execution. And I'm just going to quickly copy the whole thing into the grid. So again, override function, on mouse button down, paste this guy in, delete the old one, connect the execution, and we should be good to go. So hit play, press B, we have all the selections. So let's say we want to build a door. Once we click on it, the widget gets removed and the build mode is getting initialized. There we go, so we can place it down. I can't build it over here because I have the allowed and forbidden location, so I'm only able to build over here, but everything seems to be functioning. Now the one issue is we can't disable the build mode, but if we change to a different buildable, it gets stopped. So let's fix that. So whenever we press B, we want to make sure that the build mode gets shut off if it's on. So under the third person character, where we enable the build mode, so here we enable the widget to be displayed on the screen. What we can do is grab our build component, and from this we can run a stop build mode event, which will stop our build mode. There we go. This is a run on only client, so that's correct. And also let's see, so whenever we add this, what I also want to do is if we click the B key and our build mode is already on, I want it to disable the build mode, because at this point, if we press B, select the buildable, we press B again, it's going to disable it, but it's going to show us the widget. I don't want necessarily to have the widget pop up. So let's say maybe I want to select the buildable and have to press B twice to get to over here. So the first click would disable the build mode. And to do so, we can grab our build component, and from this we can get is build mode on, so that we can check is the build mode currently active. Then we could do an if to see if the build mode is active, and then if it's not active, if we haven't turned it on, we're going to run this code, so it's going to decide whether to show or remove the widget based on whether it's visible or not. But if the build mode is on, then I just simply want to run stop build mode. So build component will do stop build mode, connect it to the true, like so, and let's hit play. So now when we select the buildable, we can build, and whenever we press B, it's going to first turn off the build mode, and then if we want to have the build menu, we got to click B once more. So that's another option available. Now also remember that whenever we are inside of the build mode, we can use the mouse wheel to change the buildables. So if you want that removed, make sure you look for your mouse wheel up and down events, so these ones right here, and just go ahead and remove these or disconnect for now. And yeah, otherwise, well, you're still going to be able to change the buildables with the mouse wheel, but that's totally up to you if you want that or not. And one last tiny bit of detail is in our list. So as you saw, my list was pretty much all over the place, and it didn't look too organized. So what we can actually do is create this into like an actual table kind of a thing. So what I'm going to do is actually we're going to use the fill option for all three of these elements. So we have actually four, but under the horizontal box, the first are like these the three main ones: the icon, the text, so the name, we're going to fill that, and also we have a size box which we are also going to fill. So what this is going to do is it's going to divide this whole horizontal box into three sections, like because we have three objects, and all of them are going to take up the same exact space. Now we do want to change this up a bit. So for example, our icon, it doesn't have to have that much space when it comes to like the actual compared sizing, so we can do something like 0.1 perhaps. It's going to look a little awkward in here, but once we add this to an actual screen, it's going to look way better. Now for the text, we can do something like 0.5 maybe, and this guy right here is going to take up all the other spot, all the rest of the space that basically it has. And if you also want to make sure that it is perfectly centered, you can use this thing, so horizontal alignment to the center. So now if we would hit play again, press B, you will see that this is a bit more organized. So now 0.1 was a bit too little for this. So what we can do is for this guy, maybe give it like 0.2 instead. Hit B, there we go. Now it's way better. So that's another option that you can use. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you found this useful. If you did, make sure to leave a like, leave a comment, all that good stuff. And I see you in the next one.